Hello, everybody, and welcome to the California Small Farm Conference. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Evan Wigg. I'm with Community Alliance with Family Farmers, and we're really happy to have you here at this workshop. It's a really important one, a little different than your typical practical farm tools, but absolutely important. This is the suicide prevention training for the farm community. And you know, it's one of the main challenges when it comes to this topic is that people don't talk about it. And so the fact that we're having this conversation here at the conference with all of you, and the fact that you're here today is probably the most important step that we've already taken, is just having you here and having the conversation. That's the absolute best thing we can do for this community. So thank you for being here. If I encourage you guys to use the chat throughout the workshop. If you have questions, comments, you want to engage in this conversation, use the chat function there, and just keep your comments respectful and constructive. And thanks again for being here. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to today's presenter, Angelina. Take it away.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I hope you all are enjoying the conference so far. So just a little bit about me and our program. My name is Angelina Padilla, and I'm with the UC Davis California AgrAbility program. And we are an occupational health and safety program. And we work with farmers, ranchers, farm workers, and their families throughout the state of California, and primarily with those who have suffered a disability or an injury or an illness of some sort. And one of the primary ways that we are able to help them is by guiding them to appropriate services when needed. And this also includes services that support their mental health and well-being. So throughout this training, we will be discussing what QPR is and who should be trained, suicide risk factors, especially those pertaining to agricultural communities, clues and warning signs, and how to talk to someone who may be experiencing thoughts of suicide implementing the QPR strategy. So before I get started, I just would like to acknowledge that I understand that this can be a difficult topic. So please feel free to take a break whenever needed. If you'd like to speak with someone after the presentation, we'll provide our contact information. So please feel free to reach out. And as Evan said, if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to use the chat and drop in any questions or comments or thoughts you have about anything that we're discussing in there. All right, so let's get started. So just a quick overview of QPR and what it is. QPR is an abbreviation and it stands for Question, Persuade, and Refer. And the goal is to raise awareness about suicide and how to prevent it. You do want to note that QPR is not a form of counseling or treatment, but it is an emergency mental health intervention. It's a behavioral intervention. So it's meant to teach us how to recognize and respond to someone exhibiting suicide warning signs and behaviors. It's theory-based and it recognizes that even socially isolated individuals, such as farmers and ranchers, have contact with potential rescuers, and it reaches out to high-risk individuals within their own environment. QPR training is intended for everyone. Most ag workers have established relationships with individuals in their community who serve as trusted resources, both personally and professionally. These individuals may be more likely to identify someone who's struggling, in part because it's often easier to and more comfortable for someone who may be having a difficult time to confide in someone that they have a trusting relationship with. Just a few examples of who should be trained in QPR include family, friends, medical providers, including dentists. They're sometimes often overlooked. Agricultural lenders, such as bankers or loan officers, farm service agency employees, co-op extension offices, farm equipment dealers, techs, veterinarians, and employers. It's really intended for anyone who might come in contact with an agricultural worker. So before we move into each of the steps of QPR, I'll just briefly go over a few statistics and some background on farm culture and common myths and facts about suicide. According to the World Health Organization, there are 800,000, about 800,000 deaths by suicide worldwide each year. From 1999 to 2019, suicide rates have increased by 33% and is currently one of the 10th leading causes of death in the United States. Um, Rates are higher in rural areas, particularly for male farmers and ranchers, being several times higher than the national average. The national average, just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective of what that looks like. The national average for males is 20 deaths by suicide per 100,000 people, whereas the rates for male farmers and ranchers is about 34 deaths by suicide per 100,000. Rates for female farmers and ranchers don't differ too much from the national average, but they do report having a higher burden of stress, right? And our next slide. So we're just going to show you a brief video now um, from an Ohio farmer, and his name is Nathan Brown, and he talks a little bit about mental health and what it's like being on the farm.
If you have a 9-to-5 job and you have stress there, at 5 o'clock you get to go home. 5 o'clock here, I don't get to go home because that's where I am. This is where I live. This is what I do every day. I identify as a farmer. You know, from a little kid, that's all I ever wanted to do. That's all I ever wanted to be.
Just having a little technical difficulty, so we're just getting that worked out here. You should be able to see the video as well as hear it. All right.
If you have a 9-to-5 job and you have stress there, at 5 o'clock you get to go home. 5 o'clock here, I don't get to go home because that's where I am. This is where I live. This is what I do every day. I identify as a farmer. You know, from a little kid, that's all I ever wanted to do. That's all I ever wanted to be. We spend so much time by ourselves, you know, in the spring and the fall in a tractor, a little 4-foot by 4-foot box in that tractor cab. And, you know, you get to thinking about things and you know, it's really easy to go to dark places. It's rough. It's really rough. And again, there's so much stuff that is out of our control. We know farmers are not ones to reach out for help, but together we can build a good, strong community that really can help you get through those tough times. And you know, the only way that we're ever going to break the stigma is by talking about it. We're all here to love.
Okay. So in the video, Nathan mentions farmers not reaching out for help, and that's an important point to remember because not reaching out for help can be common in farm culture. And we'll touch on this in the coming slides, but having an understanding of farm culture, having a little bit of background in that is important so we can better provide appropriate help. So I'm sure that we can all agree that working in agriculture is a very noble occupation and has many rewarding aspects, but it can also be very stressful, right? And it can really take a toll on a person's physical and mental health. For those who were born and raised on a farm or a ranch and have had it passed down to them, there's the added pressure of maintaining a family legacy and keeping their farm or ranch up and running. Agricultural work requires long hours, sometimes working with little to no help, rain or shine. So the constant stress can sometimes become distress, which plays a role in increased risk of suicide. An important part of suicide prevention is recognizing risk factors that may set in motion thoughts of suicide. People working and living on farms in rural areas experience unique stressors that put them at higher risk for poor mental health. These stressors are considered unique because they're often related to their occupation or farm culture, and they differ from those in someone in an urban area might experience. Risk factors include stressors such as finances, fear of losing a farm or ranch because of finances, a disabling injury, weather-related stressors such as crop loss, machinery breakdown, or issues with livestock. Women and older farmers report experiencing higher levels of stress, just like the uniqueness and stressors between those in urban and rural areas. There are also stressors that are unique to gender and age. For example, women often take on the role of maintaining the home and caring for children or other relatives, perhaps older parents. While older adults also face unique stressors as they're faced with the challenges that come with aging, such as changes in physical and cognitive abilities. And because we're in California and we have a large migrant farm worker population, it's also important for us to remember that they experience unique stressors. For example, they move around quite a bit throughout the state, sometimes to and from other states. They're away from family and friends in places they're not familiar with. And this is a really big adjustment and can cause a lot of stress and anxiety. Other risk factors may include stigma. Fear of what others might think may cause reluctancy in seeking help for something like mental health. In smaller, less populated towns, the chances of running into someone you know is much higher than they would be in a bigger city. And so that may cause some hesitance in seeking services somewhere where they think they might run into somebody, they know, a neighbor or a friend, a family member, or another acquaintance. Alcohol or drug use is also a leading risk factor impacting mental health and increasing the risk of suicide, as alcohol and other substances are sometimes used as coping mechanisms. There may be limited accessibility to healthcare. That's a particularly big one, especially for farmers and ranchers who are self-employed, right? And providers with locating providers with expertise in mental health in smaller, areas or rural areas is sometimes difficult. And again, many farmers and ranchers are self-employed, so they may not have health insurance or may be underinsured. Being male is sometimes considered being a barrier to accessing mental health services because of the stigma that men should always be strong, and struggling with mental health may sometimes be seen as a sign of weakness. Because of this, there may be more reluctancy to seek help. They also tend to work longer hours and sometimes in isolation. And they also have more access to lethal means, for example, firearms, and they experience higher rates of substance misuse. Anytime we're communicating with someone in agriculture about mental health, we may face some resistance or reluctance to talk about what they're feeling or experiencing, particularly when it comes to mental health. This is not an easy topic to talk about, really in any setting. So there may be some hesitancy or reluctancy to open up about something like that. For people who have grown up on farms and ranches and have been raised to be independent and self-reliant, sometimes means that asking for help is kind of frowned upon. And while these qualities are certainly good traits to have, they might create a barrier when someone needs help and they're struggling and asking for it. So now we'll move on to a few suicide myths and facts. These are pretty common, so I'm sure that we've heard them all at some point. And these can be kind of discouraging on both ends, right? But especially when we're trying to engage with someone, or maybe we ourselves are finding it a little bit difficult to start that conversation. And so it may discourage someone from talking to somebody else about if we think that they might be having thoughts of suicide. So here are just a few, there are many, but these are just a few common ones that I'd like to point out. First myth, no one can stop a suicide, it's inevitable. But the fact is people in crisis get the help they need. Suicide can often be prevented. Another one, confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry and increase the risk of suicide. But the fact is that asking someone directly opens up communication and lowers the risk of an impulsive act. And third, people thinking about suicide keep their plans to themselves. But the fact is that people having thoughts about suicide often communicate their intent in some way. So having an understanding both of the risk factors and warning signs and clues will help us recognize when someone is trying to communicate their intent. They may not be saying it flat out, but they may be exhibiting some warning signs or clues. So having this background of understanding and recognizing the risk factors, having an understanding of farm culture, and then also becoming familiar with clues and warning signs is all going to be very helpful to open up the lines of communication. So with that, we'll move in to suicide clues and warning signs and talk about that a little bit. We use the word clues because many people experiencing thoughts of suicide use hints and oblique language about their intentions. Understanding and identifying clues and warning signs can help spot windows of opportunity to help someone we think might be struggling. So it's very important to take all signs seriously. So before we go any further into clues, I wanted to help give you a clear idea of how QPR steps might work in unison. So here's a short case study about a farmer named David. He's 57 years old, and a year ago, he injured his right arm while working on his farm and has not fully regained the use of his arm. Since his injury, he has found it difficult to complete chores that were once second nature. He has little to no help running his farm, and he has begun struggling financially. His neighbor and good friend, John, has noticed that David is becoming increasingly irritable and withdrawn. And one day, in conversation, David tells John, if anything ever happens to me, my wallet's on the mantle. Please take care of my animals. So this is an example of how context matters. John has a close relationship with David, so he notices changes in his demeanor since his injury. He knows it's the situation that he's in. Given this context, John would find this comment concerning or out of character for David, who perhaps prior to his injury might not have ever made that sort of comment. So just keep this in mind. We'll revisit this case study in just a bit, but first we'll discuss a few different types of clues. The first type of clue we'll go over are verbal clues. And verbal clues may be direct and uncoded and easy to interpret. But on the other hand, they could also be indirect, coded, and difficult to interpret. Examples of a direct, uncoded verbal clue include statements like, I've decided to kill myself, or if such and such doesn't happen, I'll kill myself. So this one is often dependent on maybe something outside of their control. Examples of well, before we move into the indirect coded, or actually, let's take a step back a little bit. So a few examples of indirect clues, which again, may be a little bit more difficult to interpret. They may be a little bit more vague. And so having an understanding of their situation and having maybe a close relationship with the person is often pretty helpful to identify these. But this may include something like, I'm tired of life, I just can't go on, my family would be better off without me, or I won't be around much longer. Particularly with indirect clues, context always matters. For example, this last indirect clue listed here, I won't be around much longer, could have a number of meanings, right? So, for example, maybe your coworker has been unhappy at work and has found new employment, and they've just put in their 2-week notice. So having context in a situation such as this is going to be very helpful in how you would respond. David's comment in the case study is that I just shared is an example of an indirect verbal clue. Other clues to consider are behavioral, and there are many more behavioral clues than we can list here, but a few that constitute pre-suicide attempt conditions or observations include any previous suicide attempt, acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills, co-occurring depression, unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability or hopelessness, putting personal affairs in order, giving away prized possessions, sudden interest or disinterest in religion, drug or alcohol misuse or relapse after a period of recovery. It's important to note that suicide occurs in context, and knowing a context can help better understand the reason behind why someone begins to think about suicide as a solution. Like behavioral clues, there are many more situational clues than we can list, but a few of the more obvious include loss of the farm or ranch, death of a spouse, child, best friend, especially if by suicide, sudden disability, injury, or diagnosis of a serious illness, or fear of becoming a burden to others. This last one in particular is common among older adults who often may have to, well, sometimes have to rely on other people for help managing their farm. Okay. Okay, so a few tips for talking about suicide. First, it should be done in private. Again, this is a difficult topic, right? To have someone talk to you about it or to talk to someone about it can be difficult. So this is really something that you want to do in private. You want the person you're speaking with to feel comfortable so that they'll be more inclined to open up about what they're going through. Asking someone about suicide is not easy, but how you ask is less important than that you ask, especially um, if you think that they really might be thinking about this. If you're noticing a lot of clues or warning signs, changes in behavior, situational clues, anything like that, it's always best that you ask. It's far less important how you ask than if you do it, if you really think that this is that someone you're close to may be having these types of thoughts. A few helpful tips to keep in mind when talking to someone about suicide are, if in doubt, don't wait, just ask the question. If they're reluctant, be persistent. Of course, you want to do this, with lots of patience and empathy and compassion. Talk to them alone in a private setting. Allow them to speak freely. Give yourself plenty of time. Don't rush through the conversation, and have your resources handy. So this would include, phone numbers to anyone else that you think should be involved, maybe like close friend or family member, anyone else in the community, maybe a pastor or priest or even a counselor. Right. So now moving into the steps of QPR, the first step is to question. When asking someone about suicide, you can ease your way into it using a less direct approach. For example, you might ask, have you been unhappy lately? Or you don't seem like yourself. What's been going on? If you've noticed obvious clues and warning signs, you might want to consider using a more direct approach and just flat out ask them if they have been having thoughts of suicide. Asking someone directly about suicide is a very difficult thing to do. So if you're having trouble or if you think you're unable to ask them directly for any reason, the next best thing is to find someone that someone trusted who that you think could ask. So we always want to be mindful of the way that we ask someone about suicide. We never want to ask them in a way that might make them feel as if they're being judged or looked down on. They're already having a difficult enough time, right? And we really want them to feel like they can confide in us and that we're a safe space for them. Um, so here we have a few examples of how not to ask the question. Questions such as these can be very off-putting and may make someone less inclined to open up. So these types of questions include, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Or you wouldn't want to do anything stupid, would you? Questions such as these can really make them feel like, like they're being looked down on. They're not questions that are really going to open the lines of communication, and it's not going to make them feel like they can really express themselves. So we really want to avoid asking questions or framing them in these ways. The next step is to persuade someone to seek help or to let you help them get help. Persuading someone to get help for mental health isn't easy for you or them. So be sure to listen actively, give them your full attention, and keep the focus on them and what they're going through. Don't turn the conversation around to focus on you or make comparisons of any kind, because this can be discouraging. When persuading someone to get help, you might offer to go with them and reassure them that you will stay there with them if they want or need you to. Your willingness to listen and ask them to go with you to get help, rather than saying something like, will you go get help, gives reassurance to them and both to you as well, because you know that they're going to get the help they need, but it lets them know that they're not alone. And seeking help for mental health is difficult, and it can be comforting knowing that you have someone there to walk through it with you. So the third step of QPR is to refer. And the best referral, as I just mentioned, is to be able to go with them first. And if this is impossible, the next best thing is to make arrangements for them to get help and have referral information on hand. When referring or even persuading someone to seek help, don't hesitate to get others involved. Ask them if there's anyone else they're comfortable with getting involved, such as family or friends, a priest, a pastor, anyone else that you know that they're close to and they trust, that you think would be able to help persuade or refer them to get help. Even after getting others involved, continue to follow up. Could be with a visit, a phone call, or send them a card. Do it in a way that feels comfortable and genuine to you, but let them know that you care about what happens to them, that you're coming from a place of concern, and that you're there to help if they need you. Right. So now that we've gone over the steps of QPR, we'll go back to our case study about 57-year-old farmer David. Just a quick recap. He's been struggling with an injury and is finding it difficult to run his farm, and he's begun struggling financially. His neighbor and good friend John has noticed that he is becoming increasingly irritable and withdrawn, and one day David makes a very concerning comment to John. So let's just take a couple of minutes to think about how John might approach the situation to open up the lines of communication and implement the QPR steps to persuade and refer him to get help. One thing that I think is important to keep in mind regarding implementing QPR is that it's not always going to be the same with each person. Not each person is going to be super receptive to QPR, and you may have to change your approach from one situation to the next. So this is really meant to give you, a foundation of maybe some tips and tools to help you start that conversation. So that's just, something to keep in mind, that every situation is going to be a little bit different. Your relationship with each person will be different. Personalities are different. So, there isn't one clear-cut approach that's going to work for everyone. But again, it's QPR is really to give you a set of tools to use when speaking with someone who's struggling with thoughts of suicide and to be able to guide them to appropriate help. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to maybe think about this and how you think John might approach this conversation. Maybe do you think he might get others involved? Do you think he'll go with them to get help? So that sort of thing. So if you just want to think about it for a few minutes, and please feel free to share any thoughts or ideas you have about how John may handle the situation with his friend David in the chat. And if you have any questions, also please feel free to drop them in the chat. I see some good suggestions coming through the chat. Go ahead and feel free to keep putting any of your thoughts or ideas there. I'll just run through these. One asked David how long he's been thinking about this. That's a very good question. If David needs extra help or companionship, John could offer his time or find someone who could help. Yes, that's a good one. Oh, here's a good way of asking. John might ask, "Hey, David, you seem down, want to chat," and then guide David to resources as needed, offering to come along if desired. Yes, I think these are all very good suggestions. Community can be uplifting and supportive. Yes, that makes such a big difference. I think people working in agriculture, whether it's farmers, ranchers, farm workers, I think we all know this, they work very long hours. And, if you're in a rural area and feeling very isolated, it's having people around that support you and care about you throughout your community goes a long, long way. So these are all great ideas and thoughts of how John could approach this with David. So thank you all for sharing. Please continue to share if you think of any other ideas or thoughts that you think might be helpful. Okay. So now we'll just go over a few resources. Okay, so first we have the 988 crisis line and suicide prevention lifeline, which are open 24/7. And the two of these can be contacted if someone is experiencing a crisis and needs help in the moment. Next, we have Farm Aid, which is assists farmers and their families, guiding them to appropriate services or resources. California Health Plus centers provide primary and preventative health care services. So if you're looking for a mental health provider, that's sometimes a good place to start. And then there's also the California Department of Food and Agriculture, which offers mental health resources for farmers, farm workers, and organizations working with the agricultural community. And last but not least, we have Una Voz para la Salud, or Call for Health, and it's a nationwide toll-free bilingual health information and referral service program for farm workers and their families. If you would like PDFs with information about these resources or cheat sheets about QPR, either in English or Spanish, or need help locating other resources, please feel free to send us an email or give us a call. We'll provide our contact information on the next slide. So these are just a few of the common ones that we have here in California, but there are many others, and every community often have, churches or community centers, community health centers often have their own resources as well. So those are also great places to start. So we're now at the end of our presentation, and thank you all again for being here today. Our information is listed here, so please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that we can do to help, or again, if you would like help in locating any of these resources, or if you would like us to send you the resources that we just shared via PDF, we'd be happy to do that as well. So thank you again for being here today, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of the conference. Thank you.